Okay, this is the final podcast on the 2020 Roland-Garros French Open. Just wrapped up yesterday. And as I promised, I would do a final podcast just to give you some of my final thoughts on the tournament in general. And of course, the overarching story, Rafael Nadal wins his 20th major and 13th French Open, and is a pretty sure bet to add a few more. He could end up with 15. Who would have thought this now? Who would have ever have thought this? He could have more majors than Pete Sampras's total at all the majors, which is 14. I mean, that's just stunning stuff. You talk about records that will never be broken. Well, this one's going to last a long, long time. Basically, you'd have to have somebody come up, a teenager, right around when Rafael Nadal started out, and just keep winning this thing constantly into your 30s. And, I mean, how will that happen anytime soon? I don't see it. I really don't see it. But it's just amazing records that he keeps setting, and also silencing all the doubters. Who are the doubters? Well, a lot of those tennis experts that were predicting he would lose. John McEnroe is probably the most famous one. He predicted Djokovic. My feeling on predicting against Nadal on the clay is a dangerous thing to do. So I'm just going to keep predicting Rafael Nadal until we have a reason not to. In other words, he loses. Then we can have that discussion on, is he getting too old? All those things. But from this point on, I'm just going to keep predicting Nadal. It's it's probably the easiest prediction in tennis. I don't think there's an easier prediction. And everybody was making a big deal about the temperature and his topspin forehand being 3 inches lower and the rough, all this stuff. In the end, it didn't matter. Nadal just made a huge statement. And I don't know, they could play this up at the Arctic Pole and Nadal would win. They could play it underwater, probably. He'd find a way to win. He just doesn't lose on clay. It's happened only twice. He's a 102 at the French Open. And people were going to say he wasn't going to win this? It's just absurd if you stop and think about it for a second. Totally absurd. Okay, so some of the other storylines let's talk about Swiatek, Iga Swiatek. I believe I pronounced her name correctly. How about that? First Polish player, regardless of gender, male or female, to win a Grand Slam title. And not only did she win it, she dominated the way Rafael Nadal did. She was unstoppable. In fact, I think Kenin got off a little bit easy. I think she could have won more games there. She was just incredible. And I don't think she's going to be a one-hit wonder. We've seen this in the past where certain tennis Grand Slam champions, they win one, maybe two, and then you never hear from them again. No, I don't think that's going to happen with her. I think she's going to win multiple majors, and it'll be really interesting to see how she does in 2021. But you have to think she's going to be the huge favorite at the French Open in 2021. You got to figure she's going to be a big favorite to win it. And why not? So there was a lot of sideshows going on at the French Open. Now, of course, there's not supposed to be any fans in the stands, and there weren't. I think at the height they had 1,000 fans in there. But sure seemed like, even though there's no fans, they're getting all the attention. And the coaches. I've never seen so much attention on the coaches than in this tournament. And it was just like they almost became mini celebrities in their own right. How about Sofia Kenin's father switching seats in the middle of the match and going and sitting next to the opposing coach, and then those two just sitting there acting like neither one of them is really there? All of that sideshow. And the Tennis Channel couldn't get enough of it. They kept cutting to that. There they are. And apparently it helped out Sofia Kenin. She turned the match around. I thought that was very interesting. And then how about Danielle Collins booting her boyfriend out of the box? You're out of here. Get out of here. And he sort of had this confused look on his face. And then he had to exit the stadium. He goes to sit somewhere else. And then he looked like he didn't belong there. He looked very uncomfortable. I actually felt very sorry for the guy. He was singled out in front of everybody. To me, I felt kind of sorry for the guy. I guess it didn't work out in the end. She still lost to Sofia Kenin, but that was a whole sideshow. So we had all these antics going on in the stands. And then Djokovic, I think he was playing Tsitsipas, I think. And he started glaring up at a box because there was all this noise. Now, I have to cut Djokovic some slack on this one. He gets a little bit of grief for his temper, but I could hear that laughter in the background. So that was really, the French Open should have shut that down. That should not have happened. I mean, this is a semifinal match, and I could literally hear the laughter. They were obviously boozing it up. I mean, there was some serious drunken stuff going on up in that box. And he's trying to serve, and there's all this laughter going on. Now, normally, that's not a problem when you have a bunch of fans. They act kind of as a barrier. It's a lot of white noise. But you could hear it. And so I don't blame Djokovic for complaining about it at all. He had every right to. I mean, he's trying to serve. This is to get to the final. And all that nonsense is going on. Pretty incredible stuff there, too. And then perhaps the biggest storyline of the entire tournament were all of those marks and all those issues with balls out, just out, and then umpires having to come and look at the marks and determine whether it's in. I've never seen so many controversial calls and disputes over which mark is which mark. I mean, most of the time, they were arguing about what the correct mark was. It was rather incredible. I mean, it was like every match, there seemed like there was a mini controversy. And I feel sorry for the umpires. A lot of times they were called over. They got to make a judgment call. And then the player's like, no, that's not the mark. This is the one. Who knows? How do you even know? I mean, you really don't unless you go to the Hawkeye system and you have an instant replay. And shame on the French Open. They've been the last ones to hold out. The technology is there. And why have they been resisting this? And I think they paid for it in this tournament. There were so many controversial calls, both ways. And it's impossible to get it right. I feel sorry for the umpires. Sometimes they did get it right, but there were times they got it wrong. And, you know, we live in this day and age. We all have high-def TVs, and we can see easier than them at sometimes. We can tell if it's in or out. And then everybody's going to go on Twitter about it and say this umpire just blew this call. So it's more and more, there's more and more pressure on the French Open to adopt the technologies that are there. And they've been there for years. And it looks like that is finally going to happen this spring. And I think that's only a good thing. Because, you know, we just avoided one in the final game. Djokovic had that double fault. Fortunately, everybody agreed it was out, but that could have gone the other way real easily. There could have been a huge controversy. And that would have been a little stain on Nadal's 20th title. But it didn't happen, fortunately. Fortunately, everybody got it right. Fortunately. It was close, though. Now, Jim Courier had an interesting point. And, you know, who knows better about the clay surface than he does? He only won 2 French Open titles. He's probably one of the better experts on it. And he made a good point, interesting point about it. And he said basically when they go to this system this spring, they're going to have a training session for the players because your eyes will deceive you. And that is if you spend your time looking at the mark, balls that are really out look like they're in and vice versa. So your eyes can deceive you. You really can't look at that. You have to pay attention to the Hawkeye system and just go with that and use your challenges, but don't look at the mark. So he thinks the French Open's actually going to have some training sessions. And I'm not an expert on this, but apparently has something to do with the way the clay touches the paint. It can be very deceiving. So hopefully this eliminates a lot of the controversies, but sometimes when you add technology, it can actually add more controversies. But hopefully it'll eliminate most of them. That's what I'm hoping, at least. And of course, another big sideshow was all the attention focused on the roof and how would this affect this person's game, mainly Nadal's, and the temperature and all of that, the new Wilson balls, so much attention to that, how that would cause Nadal issues. And in the end, none of that mattered one bit. Now, Nadal complained a little bit, he complained about it himself. He did a little bit of complaining. You notice, though, it's always the same thing. He'll complain, he'll make his point, and then he's done. He just goes and plays tennis and he forgets about it. But in the end, I tend to think those lower temperatures might have actually helped him because he's always sweating profusely. And he still was. But it had to cut down on the amount of sweat. I actually think this might have helped his fitness level than hindered him. I actually think it might have helped him. You rarely see Djokovic crack much of a sweat. But Nadal's always sweating. So I think these lower temperatures might have actually helped him. And it certainly showed on the tennis court. I mean, he just was a wrecking ball out there, destroying opponent after opponent. So in the end, I don't think it hurt him at all. And before I go, I want to give one final shout out to Kristina Mladenovic. I don't know if you guys know her story, but she's just had about the worst 2 months in tennis anybody could possibly have. She got kicked out of the U.S. Open because of contact tracing, where she was one of the favorites to win the women's doubles titles. And that was terrible enough. But then she got to play the singles on the singles side, and her opponent came back and beat her. Well, she comes back here, and in her singles match at the French Open, probably the most controversial call or non-call in the tournament. And Laura Siegemund came up, and there was a double bounce. She hit it. It was a winner. And that was a set point for Mladenovic, and the umpire just blew it, didn't call it. And so a set point was eliminated, and they had to play the set out, and Laura Siegemund came back. Now, Mladenovic probably should have won the set. I mean, it was a big comeback, but I really think that broke her rhythm. I think she was totally disheartened after that. After all that's happened to her, I think it just totally unraveled her, and that played a huge factor. And it didn't have to. And that's yet another reason the French Open has to go to instant replay. Now, the big question is whether Laura Siegemund knew about it. And, I mean, to me, watching that, I don't see how a professional tennis player could not have realized that was a double hit. But let's just say she didn't. Okay. But let's say she did. Then that was yet another example of a lot of some of the lack of sportsmanship that you're seeing in tennis. And, Roger Federer, I think, should be held up as the standard. I've watched a lot of his matches, and you'll see him when, there's a bad call, he'll just give it right to the other opponent. He doesn't even waste any time. He's always, in terms of sportsmanship, he's way, way up there. Borg was also the same way. These guys show so much sportsmanship. And I don't want to implicate Laura Siegemund. There's a very good possibility she probably didn't know, but if she did, then that was just a real lack of sportsmanship. But all good things come to good people. I like to think of that. And Mladenovic, she got the French Open women's title. She defended it. They won the women's doubles title. And congratulations to her. There was a good ending after all, and she was in she was in tears at the press conference. No, I'm sorry, not the press conference, when she was given the interview after the match. And she even said she's just mentally exhausted after all of this stuff. But congratulations to her and her partner. They defended the women's doubles title. In fact, everybody defended their titles except for Simona Halep. But Nadal did, and both the women's and men's doubles defended their titles. They didn't have mixed doubles this year, obviously because of the COVID. So anyways, that's it. Probably next week, I'm going to do a video on Djokovic and what I think is going to happen in 2021 with him. And he's obviously has a huge year in terms of his history. We talk about Nadal, but there's going to be a huge year for Djokovic in 2021. And whether he makes a run at now tying Nadal and Federer. So look forward to that in a few weeks. Thanks again for listening.